We all know about Turkey, that country bridging Europe and Asia, famous for its stunning landscapes, its delicious food, its surprising music, and of course, its gorgeous people. But few of us actually know about the Turks, so in this video I'm going to tell you the story long before Islam, long before Anatolia, back to the Eurasian steppe where mobility, herding, and tribute shaped much of the history of Central Asia. The Turks belong to a vast family of Turkic peoples, including Azerbaijanis, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Turkmens, and groups in Russia and China. But despite differences in appearance, culture, religion, they are united by language. All Turkic tongues share key features, forming a continuum of dialects across Eurasia. The origins of the Turkic peoples are generally placed in the region spanning the Altai Mountains and the Mongolian Plateau. Between the 4th and 11th centuries, a slow expansion saw these early Turkic languages spread across the vast Eurasian continent, eventually forming 4 distinct regional clusters: Siberian Turkic, Kipchak, Karluk, and Oghuz. For this story, we will focus on the Oghuz Turks, whose westward migrations transformed Anatolia into the heart of the Turkic world. But to understand the Turkic peoples, I believe you first need to understand their home, the Eurasian steppe. Stretching over 8,000 kilometers, it is the largest continuous grassland on Earth. Here, geography dictated everything. Long, freezing winters, short, dry summers, and poor soil made extensive farming rather difficult. Pastoral nomadism, which means herding livestock across vast distances, was often the only way to survive. Property was measured in livestock rather than land. Families moved the herds of cattle and horses, following grass and water through the seasons. This constant mobility bred a society where political power was fluid. Originally, clans formed loose alliances under leaders who could coordinate raids, migrations, or trade. But when the leader died, alliances were often reconfigured. That's why the steppe never produced states like those of China, Egypt, or Mesopotamia, civilizations built on irrigation and surplus grain. Without surplus agriculture, there was no need for granaries, cities, or bureaucracies to manage it all. Instead, steppe societies lived by exchange, trading animals, hides, and horses for the grain, silk, and metals of the settled neighbors. This reliance on mobility created a fundamental contradiction. The nomads generated wealth through movement, but the greatest material wealth, silk, grain, and luxury goods, lay in the empires fixed on their borders. This established a pattern that would define the next centuries. Steppe political power was fundamentally inseparable from its interaction with agrarian civilizations, creating persistent cycles of conquest, tribute, and integration. The early Turkic-speaking societies developed within this context, inheriting both the economic structures and the communication networks of the steppe, and I believe their subsequent history cannot be understood apart from this environment. Now that we understand the world of the steppe, we can turn to the ancestors of the Turks, but defining who counts as Proto-Turk isn't simple because ideally we'd have written records, but unfortunately the Proto-Turks didn't leave any behind. So to learn about them, we will need to turn to the direct neighbors, the Chinese. And this is the reason why most of the names I'm going to tell you now sound very un-Turkic. By the 7th century BC, the Chinese mention a powerful nomadic confederation called the Donghu, or the Eastern Barbarians. And surprisingly, they lived northeast of China in the forests and grasslands of Manchuria and Mongolia. They are important in our story because they built the first large-scale steppe coalition capable of coordinating raids, diplomacy, and trade with settled kingdoms. But were the Donghu Turkic? Well, probably not. They were likely multi-ethnic, mixing early Mongolic and Turkic elements. But what the Turks inherited from them was political form. The steppe confederation itself, the art of uniting clans through leadership, military skill, and control of trade and tribute. The power and that of the subsequent steppe confederations rested on the horse complex, a system of technologies and practices that made mounted warfare possible: iron bets, composite bows, and mounted archery. For a time, the Donghu were in constant conflict with the Chinese states of the Warring States period, long before China's unification, which you may remember if you watched my video on the history of China. But while they consolidated power in the east, a new confederation was rising for the west, one that would transform the steppe world, the Xiongnu. By the 3rd century BC, the Xiongnu eventually defeated the Donghu and absorbed the lands and herds, while the Donghu fragmented and dispersed. Like the rivals, the Xiongnu were a multi-ethnic alliance, probably comprising Proto-Turkic and Proto-Mongol elements, but they went further than their predecessors by creating a centralized hierarchy under a hereditary military ruler. This warlord commanded vast coalitions of tribes through loyalty, reward, and ritual. This new power structure was legitimized by Tengrism, the shared spiritual system of the steppe peoples like the Turks, the Mongols, or even the ancestors of the Hungarians. Centered on Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and reinforced by ancestral worship, it may have been the steppe equivalent of the Chinese mandate of heaven. The military ruler was seen as chosen by the sky and guided by his ancestors, tasked with maintaining cosmic harmony and order among the clans. Importantly, at the time, the first networks of the Silk Road started to appear. Confederations like the Xiongnu saw the Silk Road as a source of wealth to be extracted through raiding or by extorting tribute from settled civilizations like China. And for centuries to come, all the steppe peoples would use these trade networks as a source of tribute extraction. The Xiongnu dominated the steppe for over 2 centuries, but the power rested on strong leadership as well as a steady flow of tribute coming from China to reward the warriors. So when succession crisis broke out, the Chinese Han dynasty exploited those divisions and eventually broke the confederation apart. Out of that collapse emerged new Turkic confederations, and among them the Tiele in the Altai Mountains. And the reason why I'm mentioning them is because the linguistic clues preserved in Chinese sources suggest they were among the first Turkic-speaking peoples. Here, for the first time, the Turkic name emerges from the mosaic of steppe peoples, and from then on, it would never disappear. As with the Donghu before them, the fall of the Xiongnu did not mean disappearance. Some Xiongnu groups moved westward across Central Asia, blending with related tribes to form new confederations, such as the Yueben or the Chionites, possible forerunners of the Huns, who would later reach Europe. Others remained on the steppe and reorganized into smaller federations over the 2 centuries that followed. And by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, a new power was ready to emerge on the eastern steppe, the Wuran Khaganate. Like the predecessors, they were a multi-ethnic confederation held together by allegiance, not blood. The power rested on tribute, trade, and control over strategic trade routes between China and Central Asia. Among their vassals were Turkic-speaking tribes in the Altai Mountains. The most important one for our story is none other than the Ashina clan, part of the broader Göktürk group. Unlike most nomads, the Ashina clan controlled iron production, forging weapons and tools in the mineral-rich Altai Mountains, rather than depending entirely on exchange with China. This metallurgical base gave them both wealth and autonomy, and naturally made them dangerous to the overlords. Around 552, the Ashina revolted. They crushed the Rouran and united the steppe under a new banner, the Göktürk Khaganate. But how do we know they were Turks? After all, the Göktürks didn't yet produce any written text proving so, right? Well, onomastics is the answer. We know they were likely Turkic because Chinese records preserve the titles and names in unmistakably Turkic forms. The word Göktürk itself is actually modern and was apparently coined by modern academics to differentiate this confederation from later Turkic Khaganates. The early Turks probably called themselves turque, and Chinese chroniclers transcribed this as tujue. What the word originally meant, no one really knows. Later writers guessed it may have meant strong or well-formed, but we don't have any early source that defines it. If Chinese chroniclers in the mid-6th century described the Ashina-led confederation as tujue, it is likely the Ashina ruling house was already calling its political community Turk at the very moment the First Empire appeared, even if the word's deeper origins remain uncertain. Later, Persian and Byzantine sources would also echo that name. And speaking of Persians and Byzantines, it is time to tell the story of how the Turks spread into Europe. After defeating the Ruran in the mid-6th century, the Göktürks expanded rapidly across the steppe. Military victories mattered, but their real goal was likely control of the Silk Road. The first major obstacle on the western advance was the Hephthalites, the so-called White Huns, a formidable nomadic confederation whose precise language and ethnicity remain a subject of debate. They held key territories across modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, directly bordering Persia and posing a persistent threat to the northeastern frontier of the Sasanian Empire. Around 560, the Göktürks allied temporarily with the Sasanians to defeat the common enemy. This victory brought the Turks into contact with the Sogdians, Iranian-speaking merchants, vassals to the Hephthalites, who ran prosperous transoxiana oases, the city-states like Samarkand and Bukhara, and managed caravans carrying silk, horses, and metals. The expertise in trade, contracts, and diplomacy was so crucial that Sogdian served as Central Asia's lingua franca for centuries. The Göktürks astutely integrated the Sogdian administrative class rather than simply plundering the cities. By doing so, the Turks gained the instruments of statecraft, bureaucracy, bookkeeping, and direct access to the Silk Road's sprawling trade networks. Sogdian merchants and scribes were granted privileges, protection, and official positions within the Khaganate. In return, they kept the records, collected tribute, negotiated with cities, and managed commerce across vast distances. Sogdian knowledge and script spread throughout the Khaganate at the time, leaving their mark on the earliest Turkic monuments, like the Bugut inscription written in Sogdian script. With the Hephthalites defeated, the Göktürks gained control of the eastern half of the Silk Road, while Persia still held the west. Needless to say, a rivalry soon replaced the former alliance, and the partners began clashing over control of the critical Central Asian trade routes. Silk, the most prized good of the time, became the central source of tension. With the help of the Sogdian advisors, the Göktürks devised an ambitious plan to bypass Persia entirely and establish direct trade with Persia's major rival, the Byzantine Empire. For Byzantium, which was already embroiled in costly wars with Persia over control of the Caucasus, the fortified Mesopotamian frontier, and control of the Silk Road, this alliance was a major strategic advantage, following the old trope, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This pivot led to a formal alliance and opened a new path for Central Asian silk to reach the West. Over the following decades, the Persians, the Byzantines, and the Turks clashed repeatedly. Obviously, alliances were opportunistic, with the Göktürks coordinating at times with the Byzantines to pressure Persian power, especially during the final Byzantium-Persia War in the 620s. But despite all these diplomatic successes, internal divisions weakened the Khaganate. It is true that the Ashina clan had forged a broad imperial identity, but outside that core, authority was diffuse. Tribal lords still commanded their own pastures, cavalry, and local alliances, acting according to profit and protection rather than centralized loyalty. Succession disputes then triggered a major civil war in the late 580s, splitting the empire into eastern and western halves. Finally, a new confrontation with Persia erupted in 627, when Göktürk armies struck the northern Sasanian frontier in loose coordination with the Byzantines. Ironically, although the Turks enjoyed short-term victories, the conflict helped destabilize both powers. For Persia, the war drained the treasury, shattered the army, and ignited a catastrophic civil war. This chaos left the empire fatally exposed to the Muslim conquests that followed immediately afterwards. For the Turks, the assassination of their powerful ruler also triggered internal breakdown. Rival tribal factions fought for supremacy, weakening the Western Göktürk Khaganate. The Tang dynasty exploited these divisions ruthlessly. The Eastern Khaganate fell to Tang control in 630, and by the mid-7th century, the Western realm had also been subdued. In the east, the Göktürk elites were absorbed as vassals within the Tang military and administrative system, supplying horses and soldiers to the empire, while in the west, the former confederation fragmented into rival groups. Did this fragmentation mark the end of the Turkic power there? No, but it set the Turks on very different trajectories. The Eastern Turkic Khaganate was successfully revived in 682 by a rebellion of the Ashina clan against the Chinese, but the success was relatively short-lived, and power on the Mongolian plateau was soon taken by another Turkic confederation, the Oghuz. Of course, this video cannot tell the story of all the Turkic confederations, but although the primary goal of the video is to trace the westward expansion of the Turks towards Anatolia, I think it's still important to mention that the Ashina clan and the Second Göktürk Khaganate gave us the oldest written inscription in the Old Turkic script, the Orhon inscriptions in the 8th century. These inscriptions give us a direct look at the language, grammar, and vocabulary of early Turkic peoples, but also show how the early Turks understood power and statecraft. If you are interested, I highly encourage you to go and check out the texts for yourself. The Eastern Khaganate was temporarily revived, but did the Western Khaganate experience the same fate? Not really. After the Western Khaganate collapsed, the Tang set up the Protectorate General to pacify the West in an attempt to control the Silk Road. On paper, this extended Chinese rule deep into Central Asia, but in practice, Tang authority reached only the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, Kusha, Kashgar, Khotan, or Turfan. But the open steppe was impossible to control and remained under the domination of various Turkic tribes like the Turkic and the Seljuks that had once formed the Western Khaganate, leaving them free to raid trade routes. The Tang strategy was fragile, though. Garrisons were scattered across deserts and mountains and depended on local rulers and Sogdian merchants. The empire's core lay thousands of kilometers away, making it costly to maintain these outposts. With forces stretched by wars in Korea and pressure from the rising Tibetan Empire in the south, Chinese power in the west was really weak. And to make things worse, yet another front was about to open in the west: the Muslim threat. In the mid-7th century, following the conquest of the Sasanian Empire, Arab armies advanced to the Oxus River, establishing it as the frontier between the Islamic and Turkic worlds. From around 705, Arab generals began a systematic campaign to subjugate Transoxiana, capturing key Sogdian city-states. But their advance was soon halted by the rising Turkish Confederation, which became the region's principal defender. Their victory at the Day of Thirst delivered a major military and psychological blow that halted Arab control across much of Transoxiana for several years, confirming that Turkic cavalry remained the decisive force in steppe warfare. But the Turkish too faced the limits of the nomadic economy. Constant warfare strained their resources, and, as so often happened earlier, internal strife fragmented the confederation. Naturally, as the Turkish weakened, the Seljuks, the direct rivals, seized the moment. The Turkic Confederation had often cooperated with the Tang without ever firmly bonding to them. Sensing that Tang authority in Central Asia was weakening and that the new Muslim power could offer a more advantageous alignment to potentially dominate Central Asia, the Seljuks began repositioning themselves. And the turning point came at the very famous Battle of Talas in 751. When the Seljuks switched sides mid-battle, the Chinese army collapsed. The defeat, combined with mounting pressures from Tibet and serious internal revolts, eventually forced the Tang to abandon the Central Asian garrisons entirely. But the Seljuks moved quickly to fill the power vacuum. By 766, they had formed the Seljuk Khaganate, marking a major shift in the region's political landscape. Central Asia now leaned increasingly toward the orbit of the Islamic world, and within this new constellation of powers, the seeds of the next great Turkic empire were quietly beginning to grow. Like other early Turkic groups, the Oghuz probably emerged on or near the Mongolian plateau. The westward migration probably began in the mid-8th century with the rise of the Uyghur Khaganate, and displaced clans pushed steadily west, searching for security, pasture, and a position in the regional trade networks. The Oghuz eventually settled around the Surdaria basin and the shores of the Aral Sea, squeezed between the Khazars to the west and the Seljuks in the east. By the 10th century, the Oghuz had organized themselves into a loose confederation of clans known as the Oghuz Yapku state. Now you're probably wondering, how do we go from a loose confederation of nomads practicing Tengrism to a Turkish empire seen as one of the pillars of Sunni Islam? Well, to understand that, we first need to understand what made the Islamic world so vulnerable to Turkic expansion. It is true that the Muslims had struck major victories in Central Asia, but did they really control the territories, or was it only nominal control? After the Abbasids triumphed over the Umayyads, they inherited a vast agrarian empire dependent on taxing the peasantry of Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Egypt. But the military strength relied on mobile frontier armies, many drawn from non-Arab peoples, with little connection to that economic base. And over time, the instruments of coercion drifted apart from the instruments of production, creating real cracks across the empire. By the early 9th century, major shifts had weakened the caliph's authority. First of all, Persian administrators, who were the backbone of Arab statecraft, had managed to revive the old Sasanian fiscal systems, and they often ruled the provinces in the caliph's name rather than under his control. This autonomy eventually led to the emergence of semi-independent Persian dynasties, and second, with the conquest of Central Asia, the economic heart of the empire had shifted eastward, and these obviously empowered the Persian and Turkic elites whose wealth depended on commerce rather than Baghdad's agrarian taxation. The result was a vast empire made up of semi-autonomous regional states, and in this fragmented world, the Turkic cavalry found a permanent role. The Abbasids and their Persian successors needed professional soldiers and naturally turned to Turkic steppe warriors who entered service as ghilman, technically slaves, but in reality an emerging military class. These Turkic soldiers were trained, salaried, and also often rewarded with land, a system called iqta. Over time, they accumulated wealth and autonomy, creating a military aristocracy distinct from both Arab elites and Persian bureaucrats. From this context arose Turkic dynasties such as the Ghaznavids, who began as commanders in service to the Persian Samanid dynasty, but rebelled to start their own in 977. Were the Oghuz Turks also part of the system? Most probably yes. Like all steppe peoples, the Oghuz Turks were initially autonomous nomadic herders, but overgrazing and drought may have pushed many clans toward raiding and mercenary service in neighboring Islamic lands. Crucially, many Oghuz young men were captured and trained as slave soldiers for the Abbasids and the successors, and these young men were later known as the Mamluks, literally meaning owned. Their conversion to Islam seems to have begun in this military setting, and it unfolded gradually. For many Oghuz Turks, the pull was practical: access to markets, stronger alliances, new avenues for military advancement, and the political legitimacy that came with joining a vast imperial world. At the time, the Islamic world functioned as a continent-spanning commercial system from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indus River, unified by shared law, a stable currency, and a common linguistic culture that enabled an unprecedented zone of economic and intellectual exchange. And the Turks would make full use of it. Through contact with Persian culture and Sufi missionaries, Islamic identity slowly emerged as the ideological glue binding Oghuz clans together. It is around that period that the term Turkmen appears more frequently in Islamic sources, likely referring to Oghuz Turks that had embraced Islam, though its precise meaning remains debated. Further east, the Seljuks went a step further. They not only founded their own state, the Karakhanid Khanate, but they also adopted Islam as the official religion, leaving Tengrism behind and becoming the first fully Turkic Muslim state in Central Asia. By the 10th century, the Islamic world had become a mosaic of regional dynasties, each relying on Turkic soldiers while claiming nominal Abbasid legitimacy. Amid this fragmented landscape, a Turk named Seljuk emerged as leader of the Kinnik clan of the Oghuz. Originally a commander within the Oghuz Confederation, he broke with his overlord, possibly over disputes about pasture or tribute. With a loyal group of warriors, he migrated west to Jend, a frontier town on the lower Surdaria, a liminal zone between the nomadic steppe and the Muslim world. It was there, on the Samanid frontier, that the Seljuks first entered the orbit of the Islamic dynasties of Central Asia. They were not salary soldiers per se. Instead, they offered their cavalry skills to local rulers on their own terms. It appears that Persian dynasties often paid them off, granted them pastures, or offered them frontier lands, not to employ them permanently, but to secure their cooperation or to prevent their raids. We could thus deduct that the Seljuks functioned less as mercenaries and more as an autonomous tribal force negotiating from a position of mobility and strength. Over time, Seljuks followers gradually converted to Islam, gaining political legitimacy and access to trade networks with Muslim merchants. For the newly converted Turkmen, the concept of Ghaza, or holy warfare, provided a critical ideological tool because it legitimized territorial expansion while simultaneously transforming the customary nomadic raiding into a religiously sanctioned mission against non-believers and heterodox Muslims alike. By the time Seljuk died in the early 11th century, he had turned a mobile tribal following into a disciplined, Islamized community and firmly embedded within the Islamic frontier world. Naturally, with time, the group gained more prestige and attracted more soldiers, but the tribe's growth created new pressures. More people and more livestock meant a constant search for fresh pastures. And under Seljuk's descendants, the group pushed deeper into Khorasan. By this time, the Ghaznavid Empire had replaced the Samanids as the dominant power in that region. The Ghaznavids, who were Persianate Turks, viewed the Seljuks as both a threat and an opportunity. They attempted to settle them on frontier lands and employ them as auxiliary forces. But the Seljuks were never loyal Ghaznavid troops. They acted independently, consolidated their own authority, and attracted even more Turkmen bands to their banner. As the Ghaznavids became overstretched and plagued by internal conflicts in the 1030s, the balance of power shifted sharply, and a turning point came in 1040 at the Battle of Dandanakan, where the Seljuks decisively defeated the Ghaznavids. And from there, the path was open for the rise of the Seljuk Empire. But did the Seljuks settle down in Khorasan and transform into palace-bound rulers overnight? Of course not. Wait a second, have I really just animated a Turk in a bath just for you? Well, if this doesn't deserve a like, I don't know what does. Their power relied on fiercely independent Turkmen nomads, whose lifestyle of grazing and raiding clashed with the settled tax-generating lands they had conquered. To manage this tension, the Seljuks partnered with Persian administrators to establish stable rule, manage taxes, and enforce law. And they redirected the Turkmen nomads westward, protecting the Persian heartlands and the tax revenues by channeling the nomadic energy toward frontier campaigns. The leader, Tugril Beg, and his successors used this opportunity to consolidate power over Iran and Iraq, capturing major cities, and in 1055, they entered Baghdad. At the time, the city was under the control of the Buyids, a Persian Shia dynasty that appears to have been resented by the majority Sunni population. So when the Seljuks arrived, it appears they were welcomed as liberators. They effectively ended Buyid rule, reinstated the Sunni Abbasid Caliph as a spiritual figurehead, and Tugril Beg was recognized by the Caliph as Sultan, securing both political power and Islamic legitimacy. After Tugril died, he was succeeded by Alp Arslan. With the help of his Persian vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, Arslan refined the Seljuk state, further channeling Turkmen raids outward towards northwestern Iran and the Armenian highlands. This blend of steppe military tradition with Persian bureaucratic rationality allowed the Seljuks to rapidly transition from marginal nomads to the central military authority of the Islamic world. Of course, the Seljuk transformation was as cultural as it was political. Islam became the ideological glue, binding nomads, merchants, and scholars. Like in many other Turkic empires, Persian was the language of administration and culture, Arabic the language of religion and sciences, while Turkic remained the language of military command. Together, they formed a Turco-Islamic synthesis, a balance between pastoral power, urban bureaucracy, and religious legitimacy. But as we all know, the Turks didn't stop in Iraq. By the 1060s, the Seljuks were at the doorstep of Anatolia, and it wouldn't be long before they came knocking to settle there permanently. But to understand that part of the story, you'll need to be patient and wait for the next video. Well, if you have made it until this part of the video, thank you very much. In the next one, we'll see how the forces that we have traced here, so the interplay of economy, ecology, and ideology, reshaped Anatolia as the Turks took over what remained of Byzantium, which, as you have understood by now, was hardly a new neighbor to them. As ever, thank you so much for watching, and if you liked the video, maybe I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.